So we're continuing the Southern Colonies, in particular looking at the Middle Passage. Our focus questions today are what two ways of life developed in the Southern Colonies, in particular the difference between plantations and backcountry life, and then why did slavery become so important? Before we really get into this, I want to remind you guys of indentured servitude and how that system was really the prevailing system of labor in the colonies. That idea that someone wanted to come over to the Americas for that economic or religious freedom, but then they didn't have the money. And so an investor would pay their way over and they would serve for 7 years until their debt was paid off. And of course, these investors found ways to prolong their servitude. Things like fines, making sure that they had to reimburse their investor for food and things like that, prolonged their servitude. And of course, this becomes an unsustainable source of labor, and eventually we switch to slavery. But to continue, just to refresh your memory, I'm really going to focus on the bottom 2 bullet points here. The rest of it is from the Middle Colonies. You're well aware that the Middle Colonies are known as the bread baskets. Why are they called the bread basket? And then, of course, you remember Maryland was founded for its religious tolerance, in particular for Catholics, and that the Carolinas, originally one colony, split into 2 in 1712, North and South, whereas North Carolina was really for Southern Virginians who came, yeoman farmers who were displaced. They ran out of land, so they kind of moved to North Carolina as squatters almost, people who didn't really have a claim to the land, but they wanted to start their own farms and start to gain that own wealth. And then you have South Carolina, founded by English noblemen, really making a profit on rice and indigo. The first colony, as we continue the Southern colonies, is going to be Georgia that we're looking at. And Georgia is super unique. It's known as a place for those in need. So this is the last of 13 colonies. It's carved out of Southern Carolina, and it's founded in 1732 by a man named James Oglethorpe. And James Oglethorpe is a philanthropist. He was once a respected English soldier, and he's a very energetic reformer. And basically what he wants to do is provide a way for those debtors in England, the poor in England, to erase their debt and to start over, to go from being the bottom of England to being well off and contributing members of society. And so what he offers to do is start this new colony where he can pay for the debtors to come over, and then they can really just live under this new world. So in 1733, Oglethorpe and 120 colonists, they build their first colony at Savannah, right above the Savannah River. And Oglethorpe runs this government with very strict rules. And why do you think he would do that? Why does he need strict rules, whereas other colonies like North and South Carolina can kind of be more relaxed with their rules? Some of the example of his rules include people can't have farms larger than 500 acres, and slavery was forbidden. At first, Georgia grew very slowly. However, Oglethorpe eventually relaxed with his rules, allowing for larger plantations, allowing for slave labor, and of course, this colony boomed. Similar to North Carolina and South Carolina, they focused really much on indigo and rice, and their major city, of course, was Savannah. Georgia also has an interesting founding because not only was it for debtors as a philanthropic colony, but it was also set up as a buffer between Spain and England. So the idea here is originally both Spain and England put claims on this land between South Carolina and Florida. And Spain was aided by Creek Indian allies, and they tried to force England out. However, Oglethorpe and the Georgians were really able to push them away, protecting the other colonies from Spanish takeover. How does this happen? Well, Spain had allied with the Creek Indians, and they had hoped that the Indians would really drive the English out of the area. But lucky for Georgia, Mary Musgrove, she was really able to help Oglethorpe during this time. She has a mother who is Creek, and a father who was English. And so she spoke both languages. And she was able to negotiate peace between the Creeks and the Georgians. And then therefore, the Georgians and the Creeks allied together against Spain, forcing Spain to stay away from Georgia and the other colonies. So let's review Georgia. Georgia was founded by James Oglethorpe. It was a colony where debtors could go and make a new start. Oglethorpe and other men were the governors, but they had very strict rules. Indigo and rice were the main resources. Its major port city was Savannah. And remember, something very interesting is that Oglethorpe, as an experiment, wanted to pay for the debtors to come over here. And that's kind of an interesting philosophy. We have the holy experiment with William Penn and the Quakers. We have the city upon the hill experiment with Roger Williams. But here you now have James Oglethorpe with his own kind of experiment. And it's a political one, an economical one, how to get people out of debt. So we're going to talk about Southern life. Obviously, the South enjoyed different weather, warmer weather, and longer growing seasons than the colonies in the North. So Maryland, Virginia, and parts of North Carolina became known as major tobacco growing areas. Settlers in South Carolina and Georgia focused more on rice and indigo. And as you can see, North Carolina, South Carolina focused as well as on timber. Also, what you can see from this map is you have the backcountries really focusing more so on fur. So as the southern colonies grow, there's two distinct ways of life. There's the one along the coast, which is the plantations, and those that kind of go back to that fur trading area as the backcountry. The colonies soon found that it was most profitable to raise tobacco and raise rice on large plantations. Plantations, of course, are large estates farmed by many workers, in particular slaves. There are some 20 to 100 slaves on most plantations, and while slaves did work in the field, some were skilled workers, carpenters, barrel makers, blacksmiths, and others worked in the house as cooks, servants, and housekeepers. So you have wealthy southern planters. So this is where the wealthy lived. The earliest plantations were located along the rivers and creeks of the coastal plain. Because the land was affected by the rise and fall of ocean tides, the region was known as the Tidewater. The Tidewater's gentle slopes and rivers offered rich farmland for plantations and accessible water routes to deliver and receive goods. In the South, the backcountry began at a fall line. The fall line is where the water prevents large boats from moving further upriver. So you can see a GPS Tidewater stream of Charleston, and you can also see a 1794 map of the North America and West Indies. Farther inland, planters settled along rivers. Rivers provided an easy way to move goods to market. Planters loaded crops onto ships bound for the West Indies and Europe. On the return trip, the ships carried English manufactured goods and luxuries for planters and their families. This is what is called triangle trade. The Tidewater plantations had their own docks, and merchants' ships picked up crops and delivered goods directly to them. For this reason, few large city ports developed in the southern colonies. Life on the plantation. Only a small percentage of white Southerners owned large plantations, yet planters set the style of life in the South. Life centered around the great house where the planter's family lived. The grandest homes had elegant quarters for the family, a parlor for visitors, a dining room, and guest bedrooms. In the growing seasons, planters decided which fields to plant, what crops to grow, and when to harvest the crops and take them to market. Planters' wives kept the household running smoothly. They directed house slaves and made sure daily tasks were done, such as food preparation. One interesting phenomenon that develops during this time is called the widowocracy. So instead of having a patriarchy, should the husband die, the woman can actually take control over the estate and be in charge of every aspect. The backcountry south, on the other hand, was west of the Tidewater, and life was very different. At the base of the Appalachian Mountains, rolling hills and thick forests covered the land. This inland area within the middle colonies was called the backcountry. Attracted by rich soil, settlers followed the Great Wagon Road into the backcountry of Maryland, Virginia, and the Carolinas. This is what backcountry houses looked like. Very different from plantation lives, not as luxurious, not as grand. In the backcountry, settlers were more likely to treat one another as equals. Men tended smaller fields of tobacco or corn or hunted game. Women cooked meals and fashioned simple, rugged clothing out of wool and deerskin. Backcountry life. The hardships of backcountry life brought settlers closer together. Families gathered to husk corn or help one another build farms. Spread out along the edge of the Appalachians, these hardly settlers changed the face of the land. Growth of slavery. As the importance of slavery increased in the southern colonies, greater limits were placed on the rights of slaves. Colonists passed laws that denied slaves their basic rights and treated them as property, not as human beings. This is known as chattel slavery, chattel meaning property or personal possession. Slave codes were laws that controlled the lives of the enslaved African Americans and denied them basic rights. So how did these slaves get here? They came through the Middle Passage. In the 1700s, English sailors began referring to the passage of slave ships west across the Atlantic Ocean as the Middle Passage. Below the deck of the slave ship, slaves were crammed tightly together on shelves. Slaves were allowed above deck to eat and exercise in the fresh air only once or twice a day. Many enslaved Africans resisted, but only a few escaped. Some fought for their freedom during the trip. Others refused to eat or even jumped overboard to avoid a life of slavery. The Middle Passage was described as such. They were chained to each other hand and foot, stowed so close they were not allowed above a foot and a half for each other to breathe. Records of slave ships show that about 10% of Africans loaded aboard ships bound for the Middle Passage died during the voyage. Many died of illness and spread rapidly in filth and crowded conditions inside the ship. The Atlantic slave trade would last for about 400 years, and during that time, it may have caused the deaths of as many 2 to 3 million Africans. How did this passage of the slave codes contribute to the spread of racism in the colonies? Racism. Most English colonists did not question whether owning slaves was right. They believed that Black Africans were not as good or inferior to white Europeans. Most colonists claimed that they were helping slaves by introducing them to Christianity, but a handful of colonists saw the evils of slavery. In particular, in 1688, Quakers in Germantown, Pennsylvania became the first group of colonists to call for an end to slavery or abolition. Slaves began to take up their own rights. In 1739 in South Carolina, slaves had their first revolt where 100 slaves rebelled against their masters. They were promised liberty and protection in Florida, which was owned by the Spaniards. And of course, this was put down, but some of them were able to escape to Florida and were later used in a battle to defend St. Augustine against the Georgians. So answer these two questions. What two ways did life develop in the Southern colonies, and how did slavery become important in the South?